Hello, Bryony. We are on the home run of our 10 components. We're on to number 6, though, of course, they come in no particular order, just whatever we fancy talking about that month. And this month, we are looking at the component of difference. What's your freshest thinking about difference?
Well, it's interesting because we talked a bit about difference last time, actually, because of the way that the definitions have slightly changed. So let's just start with the difference, which is now prioritising diversity of group identities and understanding their lived experience. And it's particularly relevant for me this month because I went to something, actually, a thinking environment workshop, and we actually talked about difference. And we did an exercise where we told our story about to illustrate our group identities. It was interesting when we started the session because I suppose for me, difference, I'm so aware of how different I am from other people. I mean, I guess I've done this work for a while and it's something that I've thought about quite a lot. But when it came to sort of identifying with group identities, I kind of got to this place that I'm like, well, if I just say that I identify with being a woman, well, yes, I do, but also I'm just aware that just because I'm a woman doesn't mean that my life experience is anything like yours or any other woman's for that matter. So it really made me sort of think about how we prioritize diversity of group identities, but it's a very complex thing to do that. It seems quite binary in some respect when we talk about group identities, because it brings in that idea that I am part of a group and there are people outside of that group. So it's a sort of, the binary nature of that. And then sitting with that feeling that, well, my life experience is so different from everyone else. How can I even start to identify with a group? So yeah, I'm in a kind of interesting place with it at the moment. What do you think?
I think it's fascinating. I think it's a minefield. I think that it really is the place to reflect on some of the ways in which certainly the Western world has been going in terms of identity and chosen identity and self-identification, which is very complex and sort of not binary, I guess. But I take your point about self and other. I think that's really powerful. I absolutely don't think that I could have told my story. I could have told a story based on some of the group identities I might hold. I also think that changes over time as we change, discover things about ourselves, and sometimes we are shaped by a group identity that is no longer relevant for us. It's really complex, and Nancy made some changes to this component, which I think has given it more nuance, given it more of a social context, and given it, and she's used that term lived experience, which I think is really, really powerful. When you think about the thinking environment as a whole being about independent thinking and, really co-creation of sort of ideas and lived experiences is important. Yeah, do I want to leave it there? Only to say that from memory, I think a really important concept which is missing from the thinking environment concept of difference is almost the most important thing, which is intersectionality. So, we're not just streamed separately down these different identities. We are the mix of them all, aren't we? And the changing mix of them all and the intersection of them all. And if I think about, for example, So, for example, say a queer man identifying himself as a man might be seriously problematic given, you know, the whole sort of standards of masculinity in our society. So his identity is not man, it's queer man, and there has to be an intersection for it to make sense. So yes, I think what this component does is it brings something really important in and allows us to discuss it, which is fascinating, and maybe even carves a little bit of space from the absolute carnage that is the clash of identities like out there, to be able to talk about these things. The definition of the component doesn't need to be perfect to allow it to hold us the space to talk about these things. And that's what's important to me about this component, and the important shift from what it used to be called, which is diversity, which has become like a ticky box buzzword, into just a more real term, which is difference. What do you think?
Oh, goodness, there's so many thoughts in my head. I think that word intersectionality is just, it's like, oh yeah, that. Because the other word that sprang to mind was belonging. So I think at the heart of it, for me, there's a kind of need in, well, my understanding is there's a need in all of us to belong. It's how we keep things running and how we survive as a human race. Without each other, we would be nothing. So certainly at birth, we definitely need to belong, because otherwise they'd send us back, and that would be that. Well, that's love as well, isn't it, in there? But so yeah, the need to belong is perhaps at the heart of why we're so keen to sort of identify things that we belong to. But as you say, it's incredibly, that social context is key, isn't it? Because what we're choosing, what we're choosing to belong to, I don't think we always choose what we want to belong to. That's part of the journey, isn't it? That what do we choose to belong to under analysis? But we have all of these, and I'm going to use the word assumptions, I guess, about who we are from the people that are around us, the cultures that we're in, etc., etc., etc. So to belong, we've needed to sort of identify with groups. So here we are at it now, I think, for me. So we've needed to identify with things that we recognize, that resonate with us. Some of those will be deeply held assumptions because of what we needed to do to belong. They're not always healthy ones. So yeah, that intersectionality really, through a lifetime's experience, you know, is the key, isn't it? Because there'll be so many things that we've identified with, healthily or unhealthily, to belong, and over time that's going to be this amazing spider's web of things that make us who we are. And yeah, I suppose for me that's where I get into the complexity of it. That's where I get into the, yeah, I am different. I am really different, because no 2 days are the same for me, never mind the situations and people and whatever that I encounter. So all of that is feeding into it, isn't it? And of course, that is what makes holding this component so rich, because what we bring to any situation, we often say, oh, you know, quite a few people that are doing this work with us, you know, they are women. Where are the men? But even, you know, that's to say that what we've got isn't full of difference already. Like, we know this, it's so dynamic to be able to hold the space, knowing that we have all absolute difference, and that difference is accepted as it is, and is looked as a source of wisdom, actually, for a group. Yeah, I'll stop there. What do you think?
Yes. A source of wisdom for a group, but not always having to be the spokesperson for that group, I think, is really important, particularly for people who might find themselves in a minority group in a situation. The impact, the end result of holding the component of difference in place in a thinking environment is that everyone is, I'm going to use the word empowered. I'm not always comfortable around that word, but everybody can take the opportunity, shall we say, to express their opinion as themselves. And the old definition used to be around being present as yourself, which assumes the input of all of your intersectional, changing, lived experience identities. So, and I understand the reason why the definition needed to shift, because some identities have more privilege than others, they have more power, they have more voice, and the sort of social context of the new definition makes more of an explicit acknowledgement of that. So I think that's really powerful. And the old definition also used to include, there were two parts to the definition. It included embracing the voices of absent identities. And that has been so helpful to my work down the years, because as you say, in our thinking environment work, we often find ourselves in a space where it's just women. Certainly, I used to do quite a lot of work in the back in the day with parent support workers who were almost always women, and would literally just talk about mums, you know, mums and babies, mums and children. Like dad was not present in the discourse, because these were women who largely encountered women, but not just. And then we say, well, do we have a problem in our society with the way dads get engaged? Well, we write them out of everything, you know, so that can't help. So that absent identities is still really important. We can't have all the information here, because, you know, we haven't got the perspectives that we need. So we can't be talking about going to do a piece of work in this area if nobody from this area is represented. The other really helpful thing down the years that this component has been just amazing for is, it is different from equality. It is defined completely differently in a thinking environment. And I have worked in public service nearly all my life, where equality and diversity has got crushed together in a sort of trifle, which ends up being called E&D, or these days EDI. They've squashed, you know, another layer of the trifle as well. And then nobody ever stops to think that these are actually different concepts. And equality, nobody would argue against that. People get it. It's very tied up with the law, with the Equalities Act, you know, the 9 protected characteristics. Diversity is something that it is easier to brush under the carpet in life and in a workplace, particularly because we have a culture of talking about, you know, like-minded people as though that's a good thing. How is that a good thing? Why would you want to be with people who just think like you? That's boring. And so we have these ever decreasing circles, particularly I think on social media hasn't helped that. So talking about difference, talking about a diversity of opinion as we used to do, or a diversity of thinking, writing it in there, like baking it into the bones of the thinking environment, is super important, not least because those protected characteristics of equality do not hit all the buttons at all, and not even nearly, you know. So it's useful, and I love its usefulness. And as with all the 10 components, they are things that do. So we do them. They're not just written down. We actually do them by creating those conditions where people absolutely can be present as themselves, and by being able to recognize where we have actually got something missing here from the mix, because all the voices we need are not necessarily in the room. What do you think?
How much more time do we have? Do you know what? It's really resonated with something else. So actually, when you've got difference in the room, truly, authentically. Potentially there's conflict, isn't there? And I think conflict of opinion, conflict of identity, whatever our beliefs are around those identities, those assumptions, you know, there's a lot of room for what people are quite uncomfortable with. And of course, difference is only one of 10 components. So there are all those other components that are supporting the potential for this. We can look at it as a sort of as an amazing positive thing in terms of we've got difference in the room. We can draw on that wealth of experience and you know, social context, idea, all of the things of diversity of thought, different ways of thinking. But yes, the big elephant in the room is maybe that, oh, do we want all of that in the room? No. Do we want all that authentically expressed and whatever? And I think the huge, big, wonderful thing that is also in the room is attention without interruption. The power of listening, the power of being heard is, well, it's huge. And I think is a way of being able to bring difference, being able to work with it, work things through actually with it, because we have this space which has this attention in it, this promise not to interrupt, this promise that we, you know, that positive philosophical choice that everyone in the room has potential, you know, can resolve conflicts, can listen, can be heard. What do you think?
I actually think that's a really great place to come to an end, because we welcome that discomfort, don't we? As long as it's within the boundaries of a thinking environment, because I don't think we have enough of it. We don't have enough of actually people speaking the truth for them. And if you think about the other components that are present, feelings is also present, equality is present, and that whole tragic life story or identity Olympics that we see sort of out there, it's really hard to do that in a thinking environment. You can do it, but it's tempered by everything else. And you've drawn a vision there of a space where it is okay to be uncomfortable. And just thinking of one aspect of difference here out of the many that there are, whenever I am involved in projects where people are doing anti-racist work, the starting point is almost always not how can we make people think different, but how can we sit with discomfort? How can we communicate with one another through discomfort to get to a better place together? And that is how I think the component of difference as just one part of 10 in the thinking environment framework can really enable those conversations to happen that the world needs to have. Yeah, that's me out. Anything more you think, feel, or want to say, Bri?
No, I would just like to embrace that vision of the world where we can work things out together and embrace all of that wonderful difference.